Well, with that, hope you guys can see my shared screen, starting with the RRIPG 2020 Summer Lecture Series. We'll kick it off for the people on our phone. Welcome. This is our first installment of the 2020 lecture series. We're going to start with Mr. Daniel Wood, followed by two of our current interns, and then we'll follow with some post-lecture curriculum. So with that, I want to welcome Mr. Daniel Wood. Daniel Wood is a performance nutritionist at Durham University in the United Kingdom, as well as Newcastle Thunder Rugby, which is a rugby league also in the United Kingdom. He will be presenting our preseason nutrition considerations for rugby, the good, the bad, the ugly. Additionally, Dan is a intern for our RRIPG team on our international end in Europe. And with that, I give you Daniel Wood. Dan, you can share your screen.
All right, thank you, Sam. Okay, let's get this going. Fingers crossed this should work. There we go. Okay, so this might just take a second so I can get into the presentation. It's gonna work. Might have to do this manually. There we go, perfect. So thank you all for coming, and for those who are on the phone as well, thank you. It's great to present again. For those of you who didn't know, I did do an initial presentation on the IOC consensus statement on supplementation in the last summer series, and yeah, it's a great honour to come back and present some of my own work in some cases. I'm going on pre-season nutrition considerations for rugby, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So what I'll do is I'll start off with a little bit of background on myself and then go into the thick of it, should we say. So I've worked at quite a few places over the last 5 years within sports science and sports nutrition. So going from a degree in sports science up to a master's in sports nutrition, and through that I've worked with the British Association of Sport and Exercise Sciences. I've published an abstract in the Journal of Sports Sciences and presenting that was when I was fortunate enough to meet Dr. Lopez at BASIS 2017. During that time as well, I've also worked for Leeds Rhinos, Warrington Wolves, Toronto Wolfpack, so they're all rugby league teams, as well as within the English Institute of Sport for Talent ID, and with the TAS programme, which is a British programme where we get talented athletes from a young age, so from elementary school and high school age onwards, and we provide them with the support they need to perform at the highest levels. And I've also worked within England Rugby with some of the academy teams. That's going from 16 to 18 years old in professional rugby. And finally with the International Rock Climbing Research Association, where I've also presented some of my research work. Currently, like Sam said, I work as a performance nutritionist for Durham University, as well as performance nutritionist within Newcastle Thunder, which is a rugby league team here in the northeast of England. As part of that, I am on the Sport and Exercise Nutrition Register, which is a branch of the British Dietetics Association, and basically gives me the accreditation to work as a nutritionist at the highest level within the UK. So I am technically accredited to work with Olympic athletes, and I do have a few athletes who I work with who are hopefully going to the 2021 Olympic Games in Tokyo, which I'll be very happy to see. So going forwards, one thing about me is I work very practically. I will be spending most of my time in rugby boots rather than a lab coat, and the work I do kind of reflects that. So one of the key things I'm going to do within this presentation is talk quite a lot about the practical side of things. Everything I do as a performance nutritionist is research backed and comes from the research journals. However, there are practical nuances that aren't covered within the research literature, and I think it's very important for people, especially young practitioners and medical and students, to really understand when going into elite sport, professional sports, or even in a research capacity, to understand that there are differences and there is a gap between what we would ideally want from the research and what actually happens in reality. So onto the presentation. What I would like is for the people who are on the Zoom call, if you would mind having a think in the next minute or so about what your considerations would be from a nutrition perspective for a rugby player in pre-season. And that's all I'm going to leave you with. I'm going to put a minute on the clock. And if you can type any answers into the chat function, hopefully that should be enabled. Or if you want to unmute your mic and we can have a discussion there. To start with, what sort of considerations would you be looking at nutritionally for a rugby player in pre-season? So, Sam, could you enable the chat function? I'm just...
Yes, I believe we have enabled the chat. We have one response so far.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so there's a minute on the clock, guys. So let's get a stopwatch. Right. Right, awesome. Last 10 seconds. Everyone wants to furiously type. Awesome stuff. So, some very good answers there. Oh, have we got another one there? About 50%. Yeah, some very good answers there. And in fact, if this should work, it largely depends on the situation. So, like with every science, the considerations we have to look into regarding nutrition within pre-season, as with any part of the season, largely comes down to the actual athletes themselves. And there are quite a few considerations from a primary perspective. So what code of sport they are, the level of competition, the nation they're from, whether that's a developed rugby nation or if that's a developing rugby nation. The actual team or squad dynamic is really important. So if you have a team that is on average on the lighter side within their playing league, that's going to influence what sort of nutritional strategies we use within a pre-season. Their age, so that again comes into sort of level of competition. Their gender, as was suggested in the chat function there. The actual players' goals, their athlete history, their medical history, and their position. These are all primary considerations that inevitably just come into the context of the athlete and their situation. So all of the answers there would be taken into consideration, definitely. So there are times when low carb and a high protein would work. Sufficient calorie intake, especially in females, yeah, that's very good. Creatine supplementation, caloric intake, yeah. So all of those things would be considered within pre-season for nutrition. Nice work. So within this presentation, I'm mostly going to look at the two largest codes. There are actually several codes of rugby, especially if you're including sort of the newer forms of rugby, such as Rugby X. But I'm going to mostly focus within Rugby Union and Rugby League because that's where most of the research is. And generally, when working as a practitioner, you tend to use both codes within the research and within practice just because they have very similar common considerations. I'll also talk a little bit about Rugby Sevens and obviously open up to the other codes as needed. Additionally, I'll mostly be talking about the male side of the game. It's not from a fact of discounting the female side of the game, it's just there is more research within the male side of the game. I'm happy to talk about the female game more during the question section. So when it comes down to pre-season nutrition, the common considerations in terms of nutrition come down to a mixture of these four things. And this is at the level that I would talk to athletes with. So if I was going into Newcastle Thunder and I was talking to the teams I usually work with, this is the level of, let's say, the level of knowledge I would work with them at. Just the simple ideas of get big, get fast, get fit, and robustness and being robust against injury. Now, in terms of the coaching staff, I might talk a little bit more in depth from that. So look at the energy balance, the body composition of the players, the performance and training requirements, as well as soft tissue management. But really all of that is based off the knowledge and the practical skills that the players can develop. Now, the players I typically get will be from 16 upwards. So there's a lot of room and a lot of potential there to develop some really good nutritional knowledge and skills that will eventually work into really good eating behaviours, and from there lead to performance and a long career within rugby. And that is universal for every portion of the season, but for in pre-season this is very, very important, mostly because this is the time when practitioners have the most sort of face time and can do the most work with the athletes. Also, in these conditions, the players can get put through quite some difficult and challenging times. So these are photos from last year's pre-season camp with the Royal Navy for Newcastle Thunder for the under-18s. And yes, I did join in with this. I think during this day of training, we worked out that they burned approximately 8,000 calories during this one day of training. And we had 3 days there. So everyone was sleep deprived, and this is quite a common thing to happen within rugby clubs. So you might, in professional rugby, so you might even have 2 or 3 of these within the pre-season, depending on the coaching staff, shall we say. So going into a little bit into the research, we'll start off with senior players, and then we'll work into the different categories we discussed beforehand. Now, within rugby, for both rugby union and rugby league, body composition and body weight will be the main drivers, and this is down to a few different factors. Firstly, they're relatively easy to measure, and they are understood by both players and coaches. Both the players, the coaches, and again all of the support staff can work with body weight and body composition. And generally, if you've got a higher lean body mass, a lower body fat percentage, or carrying around less undesirable weight, that can reduce risk of injuries down the line and a few other things. But in terms of the senior players, we were looking to reduce and prevent injury, reduce body fat mass, increase their speed, and I've put fitness in inverted commas there because that's the term that would normally be used. In reality, it would be looking at their cardiovascular injury. There's more of aerobic endurance in terms of gameplay, but also repeated sprint ability and recovery in terms of their actual sprint speed as well, being able to work around the breakdown, as well as their stuff in the gym. So increasing strength and power outputs, and really looking to hit the numbers in the gym. These would be the areas that within a senior professional team would be focused on within the majority of teams. Now, when you get into academy players, things get a little bit more complicated. So with an academy player, they will generally have higher energy expenditure than a professional senior player during pretty much every point of the season, but pre-season especially is a very trying time. They have greater training and game commitments. So an academy player, I'll use an example of Newcastle Thunder, will have multiple team commitments. So not only will, let's say, a second year player not only will they be training with the under-18 squad, but they'll also have opportunity to train with the senior development, the senior firsts, and England Rugby League, depending on their level. They'll have academic and life stress that senior players do not have. They've also got to grow and mature. So these guys are still growing, despite the fact that you'll rock up to the stadium and find that everyone is taller than you. I think it's a hard pill to swallow for any support staff. But yeah, these guys have got less resources, so there's less funding for academy players. They have to deal with quite a lot more than your senior players, and this shows with the nutrition side of things. So going into the research a little bit, within junior elite, so this is at the NRL level in Australia, the only actual differences between starters and non-starters anthropometrically comes down to their height, which is obviously out of a player's control, and their body mass. When you look into the UK in 2016, and this is from Super League, so this will be Leeds Rhinos, I will believe, from the author. Across forwards and backs, as well as the whole squad, the differences between academy and professional will be their height, again, uncontrollable, but considering the players are growing at academy age, and also their body mass. However, during this time, when they develop into professional players, their body fat percentage decreases. So the differences between academy and professional is that the professional players are heavier, they're larger, and they've got lower body fat percentages, meaning they've got greater lean body mass, which translates into the game. However, when we look at the actual energy expenditures of academy players within a pre-season, so from Costello et al. 2018, the mean total energy intakes are lower than the energy expenditures, and by quite a margin as well. So considering that within this study, players were observed to have over 600 calories greater than previously reported in both academy and senior players in similar points in the year, they were still in an energy deficit of nearly 400 calories a day, which does result in undesired reductions in body mass. And from working within that type of environment and within a similar team, I can definitely say the majority of the challenges for the majority of the players from academy is generally to put mass on. And obviously from the senior point of view is to reduce mass and generally get fitter. And these are generalizations. You will have players from the academy teams who do need to reduce their body fat mass, in the same way you will have senior players who need to increase their lean body mass. These things come on a continuum, but since this is such a large topic, I'm working with the majority and generalizing slightly. When it comes down to working with these players, so in both terms of the senior players and the younger academy players, this comes down to energy balance. Now, what I'm going to go through now is pretty much taken from my support that I've given these teams within the past. So if it does go a little simple, that is simply just because it is meant for rugby players and for them to be able to understand. So in terms of energy intake, we want a energy surplus, so a positive energy balance, where energy expenditure is less than the energy intake to induce a body mass increase. This whole system would be exactly the same with a player who's looking to reduce body mass, but we would just switch around for the text in red there, where energy expenditure is greater than energy intake. So going through that, energy balance will always drive the reduction or increase in body mass. What that actual mass is dictated by both protein intake in terms of its quality, its capacity and its quality, as well as the training that goes around that. So in terms of energy expenditure, that will be made up of their resting metabolic rate, the non-exercise activity thermogenesis, the thermic effect of feeding, and their exercise training that they're doing, versus their energy intake, which would be their food and calories. In terms of everything else, this would be the general advice I would be supplying to one of these athletes. So from this perspective, it would be a positive energy balance, so energy intake greater than energy expenditure to increase body mass, a relatively high protein intake of 20 to 40 grams of protein every few hours. So that should equate to about 1.5 to 2 grams per kilo of body mass, and that is in line with the current recommendations for strength athletes, if a bit on the higher end. There is a bit of debate within research on that, and I will go into a little bit how that is sort of being questioned through the actual practical application of it. But the idea about that is it promotes the building of lean body mass by providing the right materials to build, it says the body you want there because that's meant for a rugby player, but to provide enough amino acids to drive muscle protein synthesis. And then to act as stimulus, sport-specific training and conditioning. So the general strength and conditioning that the players would be doing anyway, again, provides a stimulus for the body to use the protein and amino acids and the total energy that it needs to build the muscles and conditioned athlete that we want. Now, in terms of the reality of this, it doesn't always look like that. So this is from if I remember the study correctly, it's from a professional rugby union side in the UK, and during their pre-season, this was the macronutrient split for the forwards and backs respectively. Now, there isn't a lot of change between there. The only really significant changes come from the carbohydrate content, which is in line with the other recorded data in this study and in studies around it, where backs will be doing more high-speed running and therefore naturally eating more carbohydrate to fuel that. The protein intake is higher than usually recommended. So in the previous slide, I showed that the upper limit is usually recommended to be about 2 grams per kilo of body mass. Bearing in mind that these players in this study, where this data was recorded, will be anywhere between 90 and 120 kilos. 2.5 and about 2.5, 2.6 grams per kilo of body mass is a lot of protein to get through. It is interesting to note that nearly 0.5 gram per kilo of that is in the form of supplementation. So that would be in a protein shake, for example. In terms of pre-season for rugby sevens, recommendations are a little bit sparser within the research literature. Now, I've put on there a few papers that are very interesting to read, especially the one on the left. I would highly recommend reading that. It is a very good read. But in terms of, again, generalizations within the code, we'll be looking at keeping it closer to what your typical back would be looking at. So you'll be looking at a higher drive in terms of body composition. So sevens athletes will want to be leaner. They want to minimize as much excess body fat as they can and maximize as much lean body mass as they can to fuel their explosive movement. Also, the factor in terms of repeat sprint ability and just being able to hydrate and work at those high capacity rates does require sort of mindfulness around hydration, as well as key refueling in terms of glycogen resynthesis, as well as, again, high protein intake to fuel muscular adaptation, hypertrophy where it is needed, although that is not as much of a requirement within Rugby Sevens as it is within Rugby Union and Rugby League. And as well to repair any tissue damage that has been going on. And this is where something like the use of collagen has been quite popular within pretty much all codes of rugby, especially within this country. So some of the studies out of Keith Barr's lab have been fueling that. And that was the use of supplementary gelatin and vitamin C to increase collagen cross-linking and collagen synthesis within soft tissue joints. So going into the actual what a nutritionist would do with within professional rugby, whether that is rugby union, rugby league, rugby sevens, rugby X, if you were looking into that, which is a new modality that came out last year. We'll work off this system, and this is from the British Dietetics Association, the diagram on the left, which I've sort of adapted for use at Durham University. And it comes from identifying a nutritional need, going through to assessment, identification, where you're sitting down with the athlete looking with what sort of nutritional diagnosis we'll be looking at, coming into a plan, intervention, monitoring, review, evaluation. Going around in a cycle, I'm sure those who are familiar with medical diagnosis and the practices of sports practitioners will be very familiar with that. For the athletes themselves, it can be as simple as what are the athletes' goals based off a needs assessment from the coaches and support staff, and obviously the athletes themselves. What does the science say regarding that? And then how, most importantly, how can we achieve this practically? Because there are generally quite a lot of limitations for the majority of professional rugby players, unless they are at the highest top flight. So for rugby sevens, that would be the Olympics, or in terms of rugby union or rugby league, playing for their country. In terms of what that actually looks like, infographics are usually the most popular way of expressing that, other than working one-to-one with an athlete. So within a team, having team documents for the athletes to follow and strategies for them to follow, usually the prime modality. And these are a few examples of what that would be and how they would be used within a training setting. So going through the athletes' goals and making it very simple and very easy for them to follow. And coming to the title of this presentation, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now this refers to eating behaviours and sort of food culture behaviours that can be seen within a professional rugby setting. Now, I've categorised these into the good, the bad, and the ugly, and there is a little bit of crossover. Now, bear in mind, these are not just for players, but in terms of coaching environment. So from coaching staff, this can happen. In terms of the actual culture of a club, this can also happen. But ideally, what we want are athletes who are nutritionally mindful, have a growth mindset around food, can be flexible in terms of their dietary patterns. So one test that is often used, and it's not an official test, as there's been no research on it from it, but it is it's sort of a, I'm trying to find the words, sort of a by thumb rule within nutritionists, within nutritional practice, which is the birthday cake test, where if an athlete can happily have a slice of birthday cake on their birthday without feeling guilty about having too many carbs or too much sugar or too much fat, or having anxiety around being flexible in their diet, that's good. If they can be flexible around that, that's great. If they start to get anxiety around things like that, or just having a day off and having a rest, that would be where we'll be looking in terms of a red flag. Athletes should be fueling for activity. So like suggested in the chat there, the more high speed running that an athlete goes through, the more carbohydrate that is needed. For the athletes to be open to change, for a food first approach. So supplements in terms of whey protein, creatine, beta-alanine, nitrates, sodium bicarbonate, although I definitely wouldn't recommend that for gastrointestinal issues, are effective, or caffeine as well, are effective as ergogenic aids, but only as supplementary to a good diet. And by good, I mean something, a diet that has got adequate protein, adequate carbohydrate and fats in for energy and in terms of health and glycogen resynthesis and positive fat stores, enough essential amino acids, enough variety within essential amino acids, within non-essential amino acids, within essential polyunsaturated fatty acids, so your omega-3s and your omega-6s, having enough variety in those food sources to have enough variety to provide the right materials to build the structures that are required for optimum performance. And the same with micronutrients as well. So an adequate, an optimum intake of micronutrients would be sourced from a variety of fruit, vegetables, as well as other fat-soluble sources, so nuts, legumes, other plant sources such as avocados, and animal sources as well, as fish and red meats are another good example. Having a positive food culture and a positive relationship with food, again, is another thing that we will be striving for in that area. So being able to actively cook, a lack of cooking skills is, again, it's a bad sign in terms of misinformation. So for athletes to actually be informed enough to know not to follow everything they see on social media. These again can lead to disordered eating, where or a preference of supplements over actual food. So again, supplements can be very useful and can work in an athlete's favour, but it shouldn't come over food. And again, these can go into a lot of different things. I will explain the ugly side of things as well. So being overworked and underfed, this is more common than you would usually think within rugby, especially within academy sides, which is one of the reasons I prefer to work within them, because generally they need more help because they have a higher demand for nutritional assistance. Like I said before, in pre-season, they will have multiple training commitments for multiple teams. So if we have a university scholar, for example, they will have commitments to their university side or their college side. They'll have commitments to potentially the national team and also their domestic club. So they've got to train for all of those. And then when it comes to in-season, they've also got to play for all of those. So it isn't very uncommon, or sorry, I say it is very common for some of the academy players that I've worked with before to play multiple games during a week. And they won't play the full game. So within rugby league at the under-18s age, there is only 70 minutes in the game, and you can only a player can only play a certain amount of minutes a week. But just having to play, even if it is 20-minute intervals in different games during the week, does take quite a lot out of the athlete, and that can lead to a myriad of other things. Finally, I want to touch on COVID-19, because obviously I've been talking quite a bit about pre-season, and in the current situation, pre-season is a distant thought for the majority of clubs. So within the UK, for example, we have obviously our two main codes, our Rugby Union and our Rugby League. Rugby Union have pretty much said that they're going to continue into the next season. So this season has now ended, and they're going to treat this current period as an off-season, working into a pre-season when restrictions have lifted, when the virus has dissipated, and then going into a new season at the intended date or at a later date, working into a summer season. Within Rugby League, since there is a different timeline for Rugby League, so Rugby League is generally played during the summer rather than the winter, as Rugby Union is, the season is continuing. So we are currently on a hiatus regarding that. When restrictions are lifted and training can again resume under particular limitations, there will be a period of about 3 to 6 weeks, and this is only predicted, where teams will be able to train. That's going to end up being treated as a pre-season, and it's completely unprecedented. It's never really happened before, and it's something that pretty much every club will have to adapt to, and that is in terms of nutrition as well. And this is where nutrition can be very important. Now, for the off-season that we are currently in, one of the 3 things that the athletes that I've been working with and other nutritional practitioners or nutritionists, dietitians that were working within different rugby clubs have been looking at 3 main factors: their cooking skills, their nutritional knowledge, and their practical nutrition skills. So if an athlete can improve all these 3 areas within this COVID off-season, puts them in a really good place to start working on all that other stuff that was mentioned through into that pre-season. So working on going into their body composition, working on into fueling correctly for their own performance. And almost the analogy I tend to use with quite a lot of the rugby players I work with is having a little nutritionist inside their head, just reassuring them on the right thing to do. Thank you for your time, and I'm open to any questions you might have. I realise that this has been relatively practical, and I've tried to keep it as brief and snappy as I can, because understandably this is quite a large subject. So I'm happy to talk more about any of the research papers that have been going on there, or other considerations such as female rugby players, or more into sevens. However, anyone should see fit. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dan. That was very detailed. Not only that, I'm sure a lot of the considerations you brought up, a lot of people are not really thinking about when they're thinking about preseason. Can you hear me, Dan?
Yes, yeah, I can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, perfect.
Sorry, it cut out a little bit there.
Not a problem. What I was saying is that there was a lot of information, and I'm sure there's a lot of topics there that you covered that were not considered or not thought of in in preseason beginnings for athletes overall. Again, it is a whole nother science, and it's very, very unique in that aspect, you know? I'm not getting picture quality. I don't know. I shut my camera off. It was like all gibbered. It was all broken up.
Okay.
Yeah. No, at least Dan, actually, we could see you and we can hear you as compared to last year. We had a little bit of technical difficulties last year.
Yeah, I much prefer Zoom over Skype.
Yes. Why don't you close out your presentation so that Tom can bring up the next one? And
oh yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
Just make sure.
All right, so you guys should be able to see the screen where it says Daniel Wood, MSc and SENr. So with that, if anyone has any last second questions to Dan.
I have a question I'd like to ask.
Yeah, go ahead.
What type of nutritional knowledge do you think other staff members, supporting staff members, should look to try and have when they're working with rugby athletes?
That's a very good question. Thank you. I would say enough to respect the discipline, shall I say. That was actually a quote from an SNC coach that I've worked with previously regarding a nutritionist's respect for strength and conditioning. In terms of other support staff, I think just a general knowledge of nutritional science should be enough. I think the positive thing with especially the level of sporting support that's currently going out is that the majority of the time we are scientists in ourselves and research practitioners at the highest level. So it's very easy to sort of get that base in understanding. I do think that there is no substitute for reading the research articles. That's why whenever I do presentations such as this, I tend to focus a little bit on the practical side of things. But even just having a sort of a respectful knowledge of it, so understanding the key principles behind nutrition, so things such as energy balance, energy availability, which is looking more into sort of the more of the endocrine and other requirements of energy. I think it's really important, especially with more endurance or female athletes. And also the concept of variety, like I spoke in the presentation there. So understanding that, yes, technically you could get away with chicken, rice, and a few vegetables every single meal, and you would get a certain level of results there. But in terms of optimal performance, there needs to be variety there. Does that answer the question a little bit? I know I'd sort of rambled a little there.
Yes, thank you.
Right, thank you very much.
All right, so does anyone have any more questions? If not, we can thank you, Dan, for your presentation. That was actually really interesting to listen to. And
thank you very much.